Hi everyone, welcome to this video, and today we're going to take a deep dive in the latest Star Wars Unlimited tournament that just ended a couple of hours ago. It was a tournament organized by OPE, Organized Play Events, and it was the launch event for Star Wars Unlimited. This tournament happened in London and gathered a grand total of 222 players, which makes it the biggest Star Wars Unlimited tournament ever organized so far. So I put in the description the stream with the replay of all the games. So if you are planning on watching them, I invite you to do so now, because as of now we're going to be entering spoilers territory in terms of, because we're going to be taking a look at the performance of all the different decks. So you have time to watch those videos and come back when you're done watching all the stream, if you're planning to. So without further ado, let's get into it. Before I start, I also wanted to say thank yous for everybody who's sent me some very kind messages on my last video. So really appreciate that, and it means a lot to me. So getting back into this tournament. So as you can see, most represented deck in the tournament is Boba Fett, going at almost 90%, almost 20% of the meta. So with a 61% win rate. This is extremely impressive, considering the fact that those 61% takes into account a lot of mirror matches that happen Boba versus Boba, which obviously will bring down the percentage. I'm sure that if you exclude all the Boba mirror matches that were played, the win percentage would go up a lot. So this is a very impressive stats. This is by far the highest. It's by far the highest win percentage in the tournament. There were a couple of decks who get the 60% win rate, as you can see here, but they are decks that barely see any play. So just one player doing very well with this leader would artificially bring up the percentage. While here it is the highest win percentage despite representing 20% of the deck represented, 43 decks in total. Second most represented deck, Sabine, which is not a surprise. We know Sabine is very popular, is one of the most budget deck. But as you can see, not performing particularly well with a under 50% win rate, which is also what I was personally expecting. I think that I said it in my previous video on the Polish tournament. I still think it's true today. Sabine simply is a very powerful deck, but is relatively poorly positioned in the meta. It doesn't play very well against the popular decks. Very well represented as well, Darth Vader, which was basically not played at all during the Polish tournament, or barely any play in the Polish tournament. This time around, the third most represented deck. Vader has the reputation of doing relatively well against Boba, and relatively well against other control decks. It's a powerful deck. Unfortunately, does poorly versus Sabine, which makes it a very dangerous deck to play in a metagame where still Sabine represents 32 decks in total. That still is very dangerous to play a Vader deck when you know when you're going to be encountering a Sabine deck, you're going to be in a big of a pickle. Going into with a 40% win rate, which is not great to say the least. But there is at least two Vader decks who did very well in the tournament. So that's encouraging for the deck. But you need to be dodging those aggro matchups for sure. Iden Versio, very represented with a 50% win rate. It was the second most played deck during the Polish tournament. This time it's a little bit lower, but still doing okay. And a lot more represented than what I was expecting. Leia Organa, representing 20 decks and 50%, a bit more than 50% win rate. Then we got Director Krennic, which also has a decent amount of play. Keep in mind, Iden's Krennic decks are very similar to one another usually, so you could even combine those two decks together, and then it would be pretty much the second most represented deck then, if those two stats were combined. And then Luke Skywalker, which did not see much play during the Super Showdown Polish tournament, but did quite well. Did show up quite a bit in this tournament with 14 decks in total, one of them doing very well, in going up to a 41% win rate. And then we got a bunch of other decks. Almost every leader has been represented in this tournament except Gene Urso. Even IG88, there's one player who actually brought the deck as well. And a couple of decks who did very well despite not being very represented. Palpatine and also one player playing Assault also did very well. That's the overall look of the tournament. As you can see, Boba is dominating quite heavily here, 61% win rate, while also being the most represented deck. That means you're going to see a lot of Boba Fett in the top tables. Once again, I want to put a couple of caveat into what I'm saying here. So this is still very early on in the game lifespan. A lot of people still are not very familiar with the deck, even among the players who perform very well. A lot of those players were not super experienced with the game. They basically said it themselves. You could see it because they were doing interviews after the games, and you could see a lot of times those players did not necessarily have a lot of experience. And that's even considering the players who were among the top performers. So even if you take into account the bottom performers as well, a lot of players are still kind of learning the game. So you have to take everything you see here in this tournament results with a grain of salt, because people are still figuring out the game. A lot of people have been taking lists on the internet without really being able to do their own research. A lot of people are just bringing their own homebrew without really a lot of in-depth testing. So this also has to be taken into a grain of salt. You're not talking about most of the players that you're seeing here on this tournament are not people who've been grinding the game on TTS for 6 months like I did, or like a lot of other players did. So that has to be taken into account in terms of the result that you're seeing and the outlier that might emerge from this, and also some of the very maybe a little bit unusual deck choices that you're going to see among the decks. You have to take this into account. So now let's take a look at more precisely at who did perform better here in the top 8. So you can see there were no top 8 cut. It was 8 rounds of Swiss. So as you can see here in the top 8 is entirely covered of Boba Fett, which is something we'll talk about. Boba Fett did extremely well in this tournament, as not only was it the most represented, also the highest win percentage. And as you can see, we have a complete top 8 made of Boba Fett, which is not a good sign for a card game. This is definitely something that is a big red flag. But it's not all doom and gloom. As you can see, as you go down into top 16, things start to diversify a lot more. You got Vaders, you got Leia, you got Palpatine, you got Iden, you got Grand Inquisitor. So some outliers and some really interesting things going on. And keep in mind that those players here, between those players in top 16 and those players in top 8, there's only one win difference. So if you look at the top 16, things are not so bad after all. But obviously Boba, I said it, you've heard me doing my tier list, you've heard me during my video when I talk about Boba. I think, and I'm completely convinced, that Boba is the strongest deck in the game, specifically Boba Green is the strongest deck in the game, and I think all the data that we have basically back this up. We already knew going into this game. We've played as I said, some tournament on TTS for a very long time now, since the game has been released. Obviously, we didn't have the full card pool, but we did a lot of testing. We did a lot of tournaments. We did a lot of playtests, and from our observations, everybody knew even before the release of the game, everybody knew that Boba Green was going to be the strongest deck. We didn't, of course, everything needs to be confirmed here with tournament result, and as I said earlier, even this tournament result has to be taken with a grain of salt, and there's something to consider. But it is, I think, relatively undeniable, in my opinion, that Green Boba is the strongest deck in the game. As I said, it's not unbeatable, and we'll still have a lot of time. Things are still very new. There's still a lot of very talented players who can find proper solutions to deal with it, or at least to fight it. But for now, that's the situation we're in right now as I'm making this video, and it's very, very much confirmed by this tournament results. I'm going to be honest, I was not expecting to see such a dominance of Boba Fett. I was definitely expecting the field and the top cut to be a little bit more diverse than this. I would have expected to see a couple of Idens, I would expect to see at least a couple of Sabine, a couple of Krennic, maybe some Luke, maybe some Han, but a full Boba Fett top 8 is quite a surprise even to me. Even though I know Boba is the strongest, and I still believe, and I always believed right from the get-go that Boba was going to be the best deck, I was not expecting to see such a dominance so early on in the game's lifespan. Okay, so now that we've said all that, let's jump into, so we're going to be taking a deep look at the top 11, because it turns out the top 11 is far more interesting than the top 8. So we're going to start by the top 11 with the list of Simon Harvey. So Simon Harvey was playing a Palpatine Administrative Tower, a Palpatine Yellow deck, which is a very interesting design. So his deck is extremely interesting because it is basically, so Palpatine is the greediest leader in the game. He's the leader that is definitely gonna be the weakest in the early game by far, but the strongest in the late game. So he's a very big gamble. If you fall against any deck that plays too fast, that is aggressive, you are going to lose almost 100%, because it's basically the equivalent of not playing with a leader for like 8 turns. So in my leader tier list video, you probably know my opinion about Palpatine. I think this Palpatine has one of the least powerful leader ability. It's not the worst, but it really is not a very strong leader ability. And he's also a leader that deploys extremely late. And those two things combined makes this deck extremely vulnerable in the early stages of the game. And this is why it's so difficult to play Palpatine in a field where there's aggro players, because against aggro, you don't stand a chance. Unless the aggro player is extremely unlucky, or you had like your matchup is going to be unfavored by about 80 to 20%, and that's a relatively conservative approach. With all that being said, this is by far the most interesting build that I've ever seen of Palpatine. It's a really cool build, and it's a build that is very unique. I've never seen anything like this before, and it's quite something to say because I've been playing the game on all the pre-release season, during the spoiler season, where people were playing a lot of different stuff, and I've never seen anyone putting something like this, and it makes a lot of sense. It's a really well-built deck. You can see it got those early drops to manage the early game. The Emperor Wars God of War, which is amazing with Palpatine. Console Viper to deal with the aggro decks. The 30 HP base, which is very much needed when you're playing Palpatine in order to stay alive until Palpatine comes online. Some strong yellow-black card staples. Some ramp, obviously, to get faster into Palpatine. And then some super powerful late-game card like Vader and Devastator. And also some cool stuff that allows you to buy sometimes. No Good to Me Dead. Asteroid Sanctuary. Waylay, which will tempo the game and give you some time, and obviously the Barrage. One copy of Sneak Attack, which I think is actually quite cool in this specific deck. You can basically Sneak Attack a Devastator, could be a good play. Sneak Attack a Vader could be something that keeps you alive. So a lot of plays which are very which do card disadvantage, but you don't care too much about card disadvantage whenever you're playing Palpatine, because you know if you can delay the game enough to get to the late game, you're going to be in a very good position. And then we got some really cool synergies with Palpatine's ability, where you get to use Change of Heart to steal opponent unit, attack with that unit, and then you can sacrifice that unit using Palpatine's ability. And you can do this with Change of Heart, and you can also do this with Traitorous if you're afraid of your opponent having an answer to Traitorous. So this means that you get back the unit, and then unit doesn't come back to your opponent's turn. So this is like a very cool build, and is very much something I would like to try for myself. In the sideboard, we have also a lot of cool things. We got some more protection, early protection, more Traitorous in matchup where it's good, Rook in matchup where it's good. The Cunning I'm a bit more skeptical about. I'm not exactly sure what the Cunning is for. And then we got 3 copies of Relentless, which is definitely a very strong asset against control decks. We also have the details about their win and losses, which is very interesting. So you can see that he's basically lost against a Grand Admiral Thrawn and a Boba Fett in the final. So Grand Admiral Thrawn, we actually saw that game in camera. The Grand Admiral Thrawn simply had better late game tools. And his Thrawn deck was actually very cool as well. It's a Thrawn Blue deck, which is, it's not as original. A lot of people have been thinking about Thrawn Blue, and I think if you're going to be running Thrawn, the Thrawn Blue is the best version. But it was a very interesting games. You're gonna be able to see this in the stream. Something worth noticing though is that, as you can see, he hasn't played against a single aggro deck, and that is basically probably the reason why he did so well. I think that if this deck would have encountered any Leia or Sabine, he would have been a world of trouble. So, in my opinion, is this deck going to be? I think this is true, by the way, of every Palpatine deck, even though this is by far the most unique version of Palpatine I've seen. It's going to be true for every single Palpatine deck. Palpatines almost auto lose to aggro, almost. And I think that the fact that he hasn't encountered any aggro player has tremendously helped him in doing so well in the tournament, going in with 6-2 and with the top 11 cut. So we'll close that, and we're going into our next deck, which is a Grand Inquisitor with blue. This build is definitely something that a lot of people have tried with the Grand Inquisitor. Grand Inquisitor, there's simply a lot of cool synergies with Grand Inquisitor in blue. You get the Scoutback Pursuer, which is super strong with Admiral Thrawn. Sorry, with Inquisitor. You got Blaze Malbus, really good with Inquisitor. Rug Survivor to a lower extent, and obviously you got all the Grand Inquisitor package with the Seven Sisters, the Fifth Brother, and because you play a lot of Force unit, obviously you're going to be playing It Binds All Things, Force Lightning, and Force Throw. So this is honestly some of the best Grand Inquisitor blue build that I've seen. The Security Complex is extremely good to protect your units because you have to damage your units and to reuse them. And being able to protect your unit that have been damaged is very good to keep them alive, especially if you're playing against someone who plays Tark in Town. Overall, those kind of decks can be very, very powerful, but they are really easy to counter. They are very easy to disturb, very easy to block their shenanigans. And I think it was really admitted by, so the player was Akulji, and it was even admitted by him that a lot of people didn't seem to know how to play against this leader, because obviously the game is still very new. People probably focused their time to playtest against the most popular decks, and Grand Inquisitor is definitely not one of them. So probably a lot of people did not really realize how strong Grand Inquisitor can be if left alone. Grand Inquisitor is probably one of the deck that can do the craziest turn in the entire game. But the problem is, it's extremely easy to disturb. So a good player or people who really understand the deck very well will be able to counter that deck very well. But if it's left alone, this deck is absolutely crazy and can really pull off some crazy stuff. So well done to the Grand Inquisitor player for doing so well. I think his build is very solid, but I don't think this deck is going to do necessarily very well consistently, because I think that as people understand how to play this against this, it's not going to do as well because it's just extremely easy to disturb. So if we look at the meta, basically once again, losing to Boba makes sense, doing quite well against aggro, and playing against a lot of 4 Boba players in total here. Managed to win against 2 but lost to 2. Okay. Next we got the Iden Red. So this being a very big debate among the Iden players, or whether Iden Green is better or Iden Red is better. Iden Green is considered by many by better because it has access to the ramp that allows you to do better, especially in a mirror match against other control decks pretty much. And some people think that Red just plays better into Iden strength because Red gives you access to more removal. And more removal means more healing from Iden. So today, at least in this tournament, the Iden Red ended up taking the win here with this top 10 finish. And this list is honestly pretty classic from what we've been expecting from the Iden decks. As you can see, a lot of removal spell, one of the most oppressive set of removal spell. We got some of the best single targeting removal spell in the game. Sorry, removal events. I need to stop saying removal spell. Anyway, Force Choke, Open Fire, Power of the Dark Side, even an Outer Aspect, No Good to Me Dead, for I guess for very specific situations where this thing does something that no other card can do. Out of aspect Vigilance, which is very surprising. I'm really curious to see how this performed in this deck. 3 copies of Super Laser Blast in the main deck, so yes, there are still decks out there who enjoy playing Super Laser Blast, and very much just as many removal spells, as many removal as possible. Even Entrench, which can be used as a removal, or can be used to on Iden. The only thing, basically, Entrench used to be considered to be one of the best card in blue, and it basically became a lot worse when Power of the Dark Side was introduced, because those cards kind of counter synergize with each other. You play Entrench on the opponent's space units to kind of block them. It's an excellent answer, for example, to Fire Spray. But then, when you play Power of the Dark Side, the opponent just simply sacrifice the unit that has Entrench on it. Can be a little bit awkward, but I still believe this is an excellent card, and it's also a very good, strong card to put on Iden. Allows you to keep Iden alive, because Iden has very weak stats. So if you can keep her alive, and so you can use an abuser ability, it's an excellent, excellent play. So in the sideboard, we see here a bit more late game with the Avengers, even the search your feelings to search for specific cards. Very interesting tech here. And some restock. So restock is very surprising as well. Probably maybe in the mirror, the idea was probably to basically be like, okay, we're going to be playing the mirror against control and try to, and if someone just runs out of card, eventually someone is going to run out of card because we just keep trading with stuff with each other. I'm just going to restock and win the game. So very next level play here. I don't know if this has ever been useful for him. I would be very curious to know if they ever used that card, because I would be very interested to know if he ever managed to pull it off. But yeah, the rest of the deck just simply makes a lot of sense. Very few true draws, because I think most of the time this deck wants to skip turn 1 and just play a removal on turn 2. Also have the Force Stroke that can be played on turn 1. As you can see, as controlly as it gets, almost no win condition. Like Palpatine is pretty much the only real card that can really win. So it's probably one of the most control-focused deck I've ever seen in Star Wars Unlimited. So you can see his matchup here. Lost to 2 Boba players and faced off a lot of Boba players. I think this deck should be able to do quite well against aggro in general, I would say. So moving on to the next list. So now we are entering the top 8, where this time we have a good old green Boba. So this list is very classic. There's not much to say about it. He's playing 3 Shoot First, 3 Steadfast Battalion, the Overwhelming Barrage. This is almost as classic as it gets. The only maybe small originality would be the 2 Waylays. Usually people play 3, but maybe a little bit more 2-drop than usual. He doesn't play the Shore Trooper, plays the Viper Probe Droid, which makes his aggro matchup slightly better, control matchup slightly worse. The Shoot First against aggro, however, no Star Vipers in the main deck. The Trader's Ghost in the sideboard. Relentless against control, and Reinforcement Walker is the weapon of choice chosen against control. I'm not a massive fan of Relentless against control because most control deck play either Devastator or Avenger, and Relentless do very poorly against it. But I'm guessing this Relentless has probably been amazing against the Iden Red player who doesn't play that. I mean, can still play Entrench on the Relentless, I guess. So still has some answers to it, but it's still Relentless very strong against Super Laser Blast and Vanquish, of course. But yeah, it's a very, very classic version. You can see won against everything and just lost to the Boba players, to the 2 Boba decks at the end of the tournament. So really pretty cruised through the tournaments, just lost to the best Boba players, pretty much. Next we have another list. This time it's a Boba Yellow. So Boba Yellow is, I haven't talked too much about this deck, but I think this deck is very legibly very good. It's a tempo deck, so it's much more aggressive than the Boba Green. And it's basically trying to, it doesn't have the ability to play the Boba 1 turn earlier like the Boba Green player, but the double yellow cards are extremely powerful. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about this deck because I'm probably going to make a video about it. But this is a deck that has access to the best double aspect card in the game, can really put the pressure on the opponent, and then by a lot of times by bouncing the opponent units and boosting the opponent with cunning. So This is a pretty classic version, to be honest. It's very much what you would expect. Even the Frontier RTRT is starting to become a standard in this deck, as this deck really benefits a lot from Ambush Unit, and there's very few good 4-drops in those colors. And it's a deck that does very well against aggro, and very well against control. The only problem with this deck is like it does relatively poorly against Boba Green. It does very well against aggro, relatively well against control. So let's see what was his record. So okay, so he lost to a Darth Vader and basically won against everybody else. He did won against one Boba Green, but that was a very early on in the tournament, so could be against someone who was not very experienced. And he won against a Boba player in the end, but I don't know if that was a Boba Yellow or a Boba Green. And he lost to a Vader. Okay. Well, very well done to him. This is just a very solid deck. And the person is called Straw Sword. Next, we got another Boba Green list. This version is almost identical to my personal version of the deck, so I wonder if John Stanford actually saw one of my videos, because this is almost my version. I think the only difference is one Steadfast Battalion for one Waylay, and I think maybe the Viper the Short Trooper for the Viper Probe Droid. I think that's the only major difference. Other than this, it's pretty much the same. Even the sideboard is very resembling. I think I just play more Change of Heart, the Waylay, and the Emperor's Legion become the Change of Heart. So it's almost the same deck. So it's a very classic version. Obviously, it's very strong. Not going to go into too much detail because it's yet another green Boba list. Won against everything except another Boba. You see, most of the loss of Boba Green players have been against other Boba Green. So you can imagine that if you would remove the mirror match, the win rate of the Boba Green would be absolutely astronomical. Next, another Boba list, very standard as well. Not much to say about it. Yeah, one Traitorous. Only 2 resupplies, which can be justified. I don't like it personally. I prefer to maximize my chance to be able to get the ramp, but sideboard is also very standard version. We can move on to the next one. David Oyland. And once again, won against everything, just lost against the Boba. Next, we got another take from, this time is from Yeo Sarah, and he or she decided to play a version that is a much different from anything I've seen before. He or she is playing the V-Wing, the patrolling V-Wing, and the escort skiff that is definitely not standard at all. Patrolling V-Wing is actually considered one of the worst cards in the game. A very low impact. So, some very interesting choices. I would be very curious to know what are the reasons behind some of those differences, some of those changes. Also, only 2 copies of Surprise Strike for me is criminal. I think Surprise Strike is one of the best cards in the game, and you should be a 3 of in every single yellow deck, especially in Boba Green, which is more of a tempo deck that wants to be aggressive, wants to be able to finish the game. Just an excellent card. But with that being said, in Star Wars Unlimited, even if you are running a couple of cards that are not super standard, it's not really going to make that big of a difference, because at the end of the day, those cards can be resourced if you don't need them. And if you're simply playing with the best card of your deck, you're basically going to end up with a deck that is very similar, that behaves very similarly to another Boba Green deck. So even though there's a couple of odd choices here, I don't necessarily think that it makes a huge difference in the grand scheme of things, in terms of how the deck perform. And that's probably the reason why the deck still perform pretty well. In the sideboard, there's also a lot of very weird choices, like the Cunning, for example, the out of aspect Cunning, which I don't think is that strong. Cunning is an excellent card for 4 resources, for 6 not really as much. No Waylay in the main deck, probably if you're playing a Luke deck and you see that but he does play the Change of Heart instead, which I guess they perform very similar roles. It's just that Change of Heart is usually worse. And then the Chimera, which I'm not a big fan of. I don't think this card is very good. It's very slow. It has no immediate impact on the game. So here I am. I'm sorry, but I don't really understand most of the changes that that person made to the deck. But it worked out pretty well for her or him. Won against everybody excepted the Leia. A Leia deck. So yeah. Okay. Moving on to the next list. And this is another Boba list that is relatively has a couple of interesting choices. The Strafing Gunship, which is a decent card in certain situation, especially combined with Energy Conversion Lab, allows you to pick off relatively small units, multiple small units on the battlefield over time. I personally find the card to be way too slow, and I don't think Boba Green needs 4 drops, because most of the time you're going to be looking to move directly from the 3 drops to the 5 drops thanks to the ramp. Other than this, it's pretty classic. We have a couple of Reinforcement Walker in the main deck, which I like. Which I think is in certain matchup can really be very strong. I think Reinforcement Walker is an amazing card. So yeah, don't dislike that choice. And the rest of the deck is pretty standard. Even the sideboard is relatively standard. The Emperor's Legion with this card showing up. I think this card is very strong against Super Laser Blast, but then outside of this, I still haven't been super convinced by it. But yeah, pretty standard overall. So that was Golem's list, yeah. And he lost to, you guessed it, another Boba. And won against absolutely everything else. Next, we got another Boba Yellow list, and this one is a lot weirder. That's the first one we've seen. First of all, no Cantina Bouncer, which in my opinion is criminal. I think Cantina Bouncer is an amazing card in Boba Yellow, because it intervenes right from the turns you deploy Boba. It gives you a guarantee Boba trigger that allows you to untap a resource, then attack to untap 2 more resources. It's just an amazing card. I like Snapshot Reflexes in this deck. I never found the space to place it, but I think this card can be quite good. Adversary Sanctuary is not bad, and then there's really a lot of cards which I have a hard time explaining. I love Mining Guild TIE Fighter. I love this card. It's a good card to play alongside Greedo on turn 1. It gives you a target that you can use Surprise Strike, and you can use Cunning on it. It's also, the Boba Yellow is a deck that has a tendency to struggle in the later stage of the game. Sometimes can be lacking some cards. So Mining Guild TIE Fighter really helps out with this. Not a big fan of Pirated Starfighter. Really don't like Outer Rim Headhunter. So there's some things that I like in there. There's something I don't like. But the core of the deck is here. You got the Body Rook, you got the Bobas, you got the Bosk, you got the Fight Fire Spray, you got the Cunning, you got the Surprise Strike. As long as those cards are here, the deck is going to do very well. Interesting with the outmaneuver in the sideboard. Would be interested to know how well this performed in this particular deck, and also the Bib Fortuna, maybe to make the change of heart a bit cheaper, I guess. But yeah, a lot of interesting choices here in this deck. You might be a little bit surprised to see the Boba Yellow players playing Administrative Tower instead of Jeddah City. And I have to say I completely agree with this choice to go for the tower every time, simply because the 5 extra HP matters so much more than the Jeddah City's ability, especially when you're playing against other aggro deck. But this deck is all about trying to race and trying to tempo you out. So I think the 5 extra HP in that specific game plan is very strong. So definitely do agree with the, yeah. Very interesting deck. I would have liked to see its perform, to see how those cards perform, because there's a lot of interesting choices here. And we'll now move on. So this is Rory Little is the name of the deck, and you guessed it, only person he lost to is a Boba deck again. But he still managed to win against 2 other Boba decks. I wonder if those were Boba Green as well. I guess this one was, at the very least. Yeah, Golem, we know he was playing a Boba Green, so. So even though this Boba Yellow deck doesn't have a good matchup against Boba Green, he can definitely win against Boba Green. That is definitely a winnable matchup. I know this firsthand because I've been kicked out to a tournament by a Boba Yellow only a week ago, so I know this firsthand. And here we're going into the winner of this tournament, Mr. Cool, who is the only player who got completely undefeated with 8-0 victory. Congratulations to him. I think his real name is Alex. Congratulations. And this deck, as you can expect, very solid. He's playing the Reinforcement Walker in the main deck, once again, which is not something I like to do personally, but it's a Reinforcement Walker is a very solid card, so why not? Got an Agent Callus in the sideboard. That is interesting. I wonder in which matchup he brings that up. Maybe against aggro, because it can 4/4 can pretty much kill anything and it gets to draw a card. The No Good To Me Dead in the sideboard, that also is an interesting choice. It's something that I've seen before. More people consider No Good To Me Dead to be a card that you don't have to run. I personally love No Good To Me Dead, but I can see in some matchup it's not so good, especially against control. The rest of the deck is extremely classic, and yeah, and no wonder why he won. This is just an extremely solid list, and he played it very well. We only saw one game where he actually played. That was against the Luke Green, which is an excellent matchup for Boba Green. It's very Luke Green. As much as I love this deck, I actually made a video about it. It's a deck that doesn't perform very well against Boba. And you can see here, he won against everything. All sort of decks here, the Sabine decks, even the Palpatine decks. And yeah, won against absolutely everything. Got 2 Luke matchup, which is pretty fortunate. He didn't play against many Boba, only one Boba in the later stage of the game, and one Boba very early on. But early on, as I said, it could be like a... Oh no, that's Garnet. Okay, this guy's actually pretty good. So yeah, no. Yeah, very solid show up here. And that's about it for this tournament. So I go back to this page. So what conclusion can we draw from this tournament? Well, the conclusion is, I think this tournament is a confirmation that Boba, and specifically Boba Green, is the strongest deck in the game. I think right now we have enough evidence to say that very confidently. It doesn't mean it's unbeatable, of course, but here the win rate is extremely impressive. This was a tournament that was relatively high stake. It's by far a big tournament as well. 222 players is pretty large. It's actually as big as it gets, as far as we know. And not only that, the ability for the deck to there were a lot of stake. I think the first player got 4 cases of boosters, so that's 4 cases that is 24 booster box, guys. That's a pretty big price. So there is some serious price pool, some serious money that you could actually win from this tournament. I mean, not money, but cards, I guess. So that was so there was definitely a lot of competition. So I think it's a tournament that we can take very seriously. At least it's a tournament that we have to take the most seriously out of every tournament we've had so far. As I said, there's a couple of caveats we have. A lot of people are still new to this and did not necessarily play optimally, or did not necessarily play the optimal deck. But yeah. So yeah, I think this tournament kind of confirms kind of the meta that we've been expecting for a long time. As I said, the TCS community has been aware about the Boba situation and this is only confirming what we were expecting. Are we going to see? So now let's talk about probably some of you when everybody you see a top 8 like this, where there's a top 8 with only one deck. I mean, 2 decks technically, because there's a lot of Boba Yellows, 2 Boba Yellows in the mix. When you see a top 8 like this, there's always the ban conversation that comes around. People think about what needs to be banned for Boba to not be a problem anymore. I just want to say that obviously this is still early on. The players always need a little bit of time to adjust to a meta, and it's way too early for a ban to be done. Also, there's another factor as well, is FFG. So far, those tournaments are not official FFG tournaments. So obviously, until those tournaments happen, I don't expect to see any ban coming from FFG. So those are the 2 elements that have to be taken into account. So I'm not going to pronounce myself on bans yet. I will keep this for another video. But definitely, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of conversations surrounding that specific topic in the near future. With all that being said, thank you so much for getting into the end of this video, and hopefully you've learned something that you didn't know about. And also thank you for the organizer of this tournament, as well as providing some excellent support to be able to follow this tournament, all those statistics. This is more than I've ever seen on any other tournament, so it's really nice to have access to all those data. And the tournament was also very well organized. At least the stream was extremely high quality, so kudos to them. They really set up the bar very high for future Star Wars Unlimited tournaments. Thank you everybody, and see you next time.